And so I do a little introductory riff on that, kind of bringing the fact that Professor Bose has asked me to do 2 talks. I figured, oh, this is a double feature, and that just sounds like Rocky Horror there. So a little bit of a theme here. But today here, I'm here to talk about tipping, something that's very different and orthogonal to a lot of the stuff that I do on the research of religion. But it's something that I've been teaching in my introductory political economy class for now some 25 years. And I started just as a break to engage students a little bit with different economic concepts that they see in their everyday lives. Because most of the time we think economics and political economy is something that happens in a faraway place like Washington, D.C. But it really happens in your everyday life. And as I started talking about tipping, more and more students got engaged in it, something that they experience every day. They've worked in restaurants, they go to restaurants. Many of our international students are unfamiliar with tipping norms. And so what started out to be a 10-minute just brief discussion usually ended up to be about an hour-and-a-half class and discussion on these things. And I finally got around to writing a paper on it, and it was picked up by Russ Roberts on Econ Talk. It was one of the highlights of my career is to have myself interviewed by Russ Roberts on this very popular economic podcast. And then also there's a paper associated with it as well. So if anybody wants that paper later on or interested in Econ Talk, I can direct you to it. You just have to drop me an email and contact me. So tipping, eternal frustration. I talk to a lot of people, everybody hates it. It's confusing. When do you tip? How do you tip? How much do you tip? There are oftentimes these cards, these placards that you go to different parts of the world that tell you when to tip, who to tip, why to tip. You tip at holidays and all these different things. It's so frustrating, in fact, that in the movie Reservoir Dogs, Mr. Pink goes on a 10-minute rant about why he hates tipping. I would show that clip here, but every other word is filled with profanity. Every time I do this talk, people send me that clip. I've never seen the movie Reservoir Dogs, but I've seen this clip numerous times. He hates it. A lot of people hate it. They say, I can't stand tipping, it's too confusing, I'd just rather build it into the price of everything as well. And a lot of people have actually reckoned tipping to be extortion. Samuel Gompers, a famous labor leader, often said that tipping was nothing more than extortion by the customers and things like this. Not only that, in recent years, probably in the last maybe 10 to 12, maybe 15 years now, there's been a movement afoot toward moving toward a no gratuities model, particularly in restaurants, but in a few other places as well. A few restaurants have done this, including one just outside of University of Washington campus on Lake Union, Ivor's Salmon House. Moderately upscale type of restaurant had this experiment where they went into no tipping. They just billed it into the price. I think it was a 15 or 17% service fee into the bill. They listed on the bill and then asked people not to tip at all for that. Danny Myers is actually credited as being one of the more famous restaurateurs. He owns a number of restaurants in New York. He moved toward the no tipping model of compensating his wait staff employees back around 2005, 2006, 2007, maybe a little bit later than that. And then recently, in the past year and a half, Washington, D.C. went to the polls to vote on an initiative that would raise the sub-minimum wage of tipped employees. So there's been a lot of movement toward raising the minimum wage throughout the United States, but recently the Washington, D.C. City Council put forward a referendum, or actually it was an initiative by a number of citizens, to raise the sub-tipping minimum wage, which would effectively eliminate tipping. Restaurants said if the sub-minimum tipped wage went up, they were just going to do away with tipping altogether. So it became a political issue as well. So I want to kind of explore this. It's a really kind of salient topic right now. There's been some recent articles in the Washington Post about this. Here's what I want to talk about. First question, is the movement toward a no gratuities model, and oftentimes it's connected with the living wage model for wait staff in restaurants, is this an efficient move? And connected to this, if tipping is so unpopular, and if it's such an inefficient institution, why does it persist? That's one of those great mysteries in economics. You always can find one of these great mysteries because somebody points to a rule or an institution, a way of doing things, and says, That's not working, it's very inefficient. But wait a minute, we've had it for the last 200 years. Econ 101, a kind of efficient markets model, would say we compete away these efficient models. So either it's not efficient and something is preventing it from being competed away by other institutions, or alternatively, it actually is efficient and we're not sure why. And that's what I'm going to look at here. And there's a secondary question too, and this is where I started out my classes some 25 years ago, because there is this puzzle in economic, in the world of economics, is that why would people ever leave tips at restaurants they know they would never go back to? Doesn't make sense. It's like leaving money on the table when you don't have to. It's like burning money. Why would anybody ever do that? So we're going to explore those things. And any kind of good social science talk starts with a number of questions, and we also like to lead with our answers. This is not a mystery novel. I'm not going to save the whodunit till the very end. I want to tell you right up front what my central arguments are, so you know what's coming here. My central arguments are going to be that tipping is indeed an efficient institution. While we might hate it, while we might think it's inefficient, I'm going to make the argument that it is an actually efficient institution for two main reasons. First of all, it solves the principal-agent problem. And that's an ubiquitous problem, an important problem within economics. The second, and this is a little bit more of a controversial, Russ Roberts and I disagreed with this on the Econ Talk podcast, but I'm also going to make the argument that tipping allows for voluntary or self-selecting price discrimination, which also is a very good thing. Discrimination is oftentimes seen as a negative word, but we'll explain it in economic concept. And then finally, related to that last question, why would anybody ever leave a tip at a restaurant they know they would never go back to? I'm going to make the argument that the tipping as a cultural institution actually is very useful for market economies because it instills a norm of trust throughout society. And norms of trust are very important in a world where we rely upon anonymous or quasi-anonymous trade. And the other thing is, it's a fun way to learn economic concepts. Right? So many times we just jump to the big, huge policy issues and stuff. We never stop and take a look at all the little things around us. And I found that my students really love this whole discussion on tipping, and they get really revved up on it, and I hope you do as well. So let's start out here with the principal-agent problem argument. Principal-agent problems are ubiquitous in political economy. A principal-agent problem is that when you have two people, a principal, or think of it as an employer, and an agent, an employee. The employer or the boss wants the agent or the employee to do certain tasks. And they probably have some interest aligned. They both want the restaurant to succeed, they want the business to succeed, but their interests aren't perfectly aligned. The employee has some incentive to shirk a little bit or to maybe kind of relax when the boss is not working. And in that kind of situation, the principal, the employer, the boss, has to figure out how to align the agent, the employee's incentives, in such a way that the employee will do what the employer wants them to do without the employer always looking out after them. Because they have other things to do. They can't be constantly monitoring the employee. So how can we set up a structure that allows the employee to do what the employer wants without having to be monitored all the time? And this happens in a restaurant. Here's a restaurant situation. Let's say you want to become a restaurateur, right? And you have great recipes, you love serving other individuals, seeing them happy when they eat, providing them with a nice ambiance. And if it's just you as the chef and running the restaurant and the customer, there's really not that big of a problem here. There really isn't a principal-agent problem. You, as the sole proprietor and the only person working at the restaurant, wants to give the customer the best experience possible, the best food, the best service, the best ambiance. Right? No need to monitor that. That's really easy to do, right? However, if you want to run a successful restaurant and you want lots and lots of people coming in, the more customers you have, you're going to have to rely upon other people to help you out. You're going to have to hire some cooks, you're going to have to hire some dishwashers, you're going to have to hire some wait staff. And those wait staff are going to be your representatives between you and the customer, and you want to make sure that they are actually going to do a good job. So you hire some wait staff here. And your principal job is to motivate these servers here to give the most pleasant service possible. You want them to give a nice smile. You want them to be attentive to the customers, so that the customers say, yes, not only was the food good, but the service was great, and I'm coming back again. Or I'm going to tell my friends, and they're going to come back. Right? But the owner of the restaurant can't constantly be monitoring the employees on the floor to make sure that they do that. Because, I mean, after all, if they were just kind of constantly watching to see if the waiters and waitresses were doing their job and motivating pleasant service, they might as well do it themselves. Right? But they have other things to do. They have to check on the stock of beer and fill out some forms and order more food and stuff like that, do some hiring. So they can't do that. So how are they going to motivate pleasant service when they can't monitor them all the time? Well, tipping actually does this. And tipping does this because there's also a little bit of a principal agent problem here between the customer and the servers. The customer wants pleasant service as well too. And how are they going to motivate that? And it seems like a simple task, right? You just take an order, you walk it back to the kitchen, say, make up some spaghetti and meatballs, and we'll bring it back to them and put it on their table. But the thing is, it's a lot more complicated of a task than that. A good server, a good waiter or waitress will be able to pick up on different cues from different individuals. Sometimes people are going to be going to the theater, and they need to get going really quick before the curtain goes up. And so they might be tapping their fingers and looking at their watch and stuff. And there the server says, oh, that person's in a rush. Let's make sure that we rush their food and then we'll get them the bill right away. Other people might want to be left alone. Maybe they're on a first date, or they just want to kind of be left alone in private. And they can send out signals to that regard. And so does the server pick up on that and do the same things possible? Are they filling up the water glass attentively? Are they chatting up the customer if the customer wants to be chatted up? Are they leaving the customer alone if they don't? It's a fairly difficult task. Well, the other thing too is that the customer wants to motivate future service, right? That if they come back to this restaurant, they want to be treated special and as royalties. Tipping accomplishes all of this, because what happens with the tip is that at the end of the meal, the customer gets to decide whether or not the servers actually did a very good job. And if they did a good job, they lay an extra 15%, maybe 20%. If they did a great job, maybe 25%. On the other hand, if they didn't do that good a job, then they might leave only 10%, 5%, or maybe no tip at all. It provides an incentive that if everybody knows that tips are going to be related to how good the service are, the servers here are going to be motivated to give the best service in order to get that 15, 20, 25%, or at least avoid not getting a tip at all. And again, it's difficult to do this because a lot of times the servers, they might have hangovers or they don't want to deal with certain cranky customers and stuff, and they kind of avoid that. And the restaurateur is worried about that. Because if you don't want to deal with the table with screaming kids and you don't give them the service, that customer might not come back next week. Or might tell their other friends with children, hey, don't go to this restaurant, the service is really terrible. And you lose business. But it's that tip, that promise at the end that if you do a good job, if you smile through those screaming kids and are attentive to their service, that they might reward you with that 25%. Keeps you motivated to deliver pleasant service. The other thing that tipping actually does here too is it sends signals about the skills of the wait staff workers. At the end of the night, I know that people count up their tips and they often kind of compare with one another. And if there's one person just raking in hundreds of dollars and you're sitting there going, oh, I only got $60 in tips and I think we did the same number of tables, but you got a couple $100. I wonder what I'm doing wrong. Right? Tells me I might not be doing my job as well. And if I'm not doing that, there's one thing I could do is try to improve. Maybe ask the person, how can I be a better server? I need to improve my skills here so I can better serve these people, which is not only good for the customer, it's also good for the restaurateur, the owner. Or alternatively, you might say, you know what? I just am not good at this job. I am not a people person. I should become a political economy professor, right? Something like that where you don't need those people skills, right? And it could weed out poor service. Now that sounds horrible. You talk about somebody losing their job or something, but the other thing is if you're stuck in a job or you're in a job where your skills are not really suited for it, it's not a real benefit to you. And it's not a benefit to the entire industry, right? The fact that people who don't get a lot of tips realize, hey, I should be doing something else, takes them out of the industry, and overall, the quality of service in the industry will actually increase. And more people will come out to restaurants and things. And you know, by the way, if you're not that good at it, and I wasn't the best at doing it myself, probably will move on to other things where you don't need the people skills as much. So in this regard, this principal agent problem of trying to motivate these servers, the tips actually help to do it, as well as it helps to motivate the server to be attentive to the customer. It's a win-win-win for everybody. It's a win for the customer who is likely to get better service. It's a win for the restaurateur who is likely to have employees that are doing a very good job. And it's a win for the employees. The ones who are very good at this will be very rewarded. The ones who aren't too good at it, we kind of nudged out to move on. And I should mention the other thing too, is that when you don't get a lot of tips, people tend to quote unquote fire themselves. They say, well, you know, I don't really, and not good at this job, so I'm just going to quit and move on. And so that the restaurateur doesn't actually have to go to the person and say, you're doing a bad job, I'm going to fire you. Because that's oftentimes very awkward. I know it seems like in a capitalist economy, people just hire and fire willy-nilly, but it's hard firing somebody if you've ever done it before. And it's like once you name the puppy, it's hard to take the puppy back to the kennel, right? It's hard letting somebody go. But if people kind of realize it themselves, they say, yeah, this isn't the job I was built for, maybe I should move on to another thing. It actually really works here. And if you think about it, in terms of principal agent problems, when do we tip, where do we tip? We tend to tip in places where the principal agent problem is more intense, right? Where you do have that kind of customized service and the manager or the employer can't be monitoring the person all the time. So again, we tend to tip at sit-down restaurants, but do we tip at fast food restaurants? No. McDonald's is pretty routine. I'd like a burger, you know, turn around, get a burger comes down, shoot them, you know if you got it or not. Not a lot of customized service here. In the fast food industry though, Starbucks, you tend to tip the barista if you have some kind of latte or more complicated drink, especially if you have, you know, I want the, you know, 2 shots and a half with half decaf and a mocha with a cinnamon twist and pumpkin spice on a, you know, every other Sunday at 137 degrees, right? There you better be tipping because that person's giving you very customized service. But if you're like me, just order a typical drip coffee, there's nothing to that. I'd like a drip coffee, okay, drip coffee, here it is, boom. Not much to that thing that has to be customized, so not much of a principal agent problem there. Pizza delivery, right? I used to work for the pizza industrial complex, right? Or Big Pizza as it's sometimes called. And if you want your pizza to come fast and piping hot and maybe occasionally get a little bit extra cheese or extra mushrooms that you like, tip your pizza driver very well. Because we know who tips and who doesn't. And the people who tip got a little bit of extra special service. The people who didn't tip, whoops, I dropped their pizza on the way over. I hope they never order from us again. I know that sounds horrible, but that happens. I just let you into the pizza code of honor, pizza delivery code of honor. But interestingly enough, there's other things that they deliver to our house that we don't tip. We don't tip our trash collectors or our UPS drivers. And you say, well, I don't see them. I actually see my UPS driver all the time because I work a lot from home. I never tip them because it's a simple task. You know, did the package arrive or did it not arrive? I didn't care if it arrived an hour late or whatever. Just want to make sure that it gets there. Taxi rides, we tip for taxi rides because we want to not be taken all around the town and stuff. We want them to get us there as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. But we don't tip Uber drivers, which is a kind of a big mystery. And I'm wondering why we don't tip Uber drivers. Anyways, we also tip our hairstylist. If you like your fancy hair and you tinted the right way and set up the right way, you're probably going to tip because when you come back next time, you want them to give you that extra special care that you've had before. But interestingly enough, we don't tip Walmart employees. When I ask people why we tip various people, especially in restaurants, they say, well, because we know that they're not paid very well and we feel sorry for them. And I go, well, people at Walmart walking the floor aren't paid very well. And sometimes they provide you service. Hey, could you direct me to the fishing gear? Oh yeah, aisle 14. Oh, thank you very much. Here's $1. We don't do that. Because again, it's a fairly simple task and there's not a lot of principal agent problems involved in this kind of thing. We don't have that kind of customized service and that kind of thing. Hotel housekeeping. We tip hotel housekeepers as well too. Or do we? Surprisingly, being a person who's really interested in tipping, I didn't know we're supposed to tip housekeeping services in hotels until about 5 years ago. which is kind of surprising. I'll talk a little bit about why that is later. Today at my hotel there was actually a envelope saying, you know, your housekeeper is so-and-so and we thank you for the service. A little envelope there. I thought it was because, you know, they wanted me to write a nice little letter and become pen pals. But it's actually to put a $5 bill or something in there as well. And I have found when I do tip hotel housekeepers, they actually reciprocate by getting my room clean, or they give me more of those little mini shampoo bottles with it as well. Now, oh yes, here's the other thing. This drives me crazy because now there are more and more tip jars at these self-serve frozen yogurt shops, and there's not a principal agent problem there because I'm the one doing all the work. Right? I never understood why there's a tip jar at a self-serve frozen yogurt place. I'm the one who should be tipping myself. It's like, I made a damn good parfait today. I think I should, yeah, Tony, here's another $1 from this pocket into that pocket. Good job. Right? But nonetheless, they have these. This has become more common as people value change less. Right? Back in the old days, a quarter was worth a whole lot. Nowadays, a quarter isn't too much, and so usually in these tip jars, people, you know, their frozen yogurt will come down to, you know, $3.89, and they'll take the last dime and penny that they get back in change, and they'll just kind of drop it in there. And sometimes they like to play little games with this. This is a tip jar that says, you know, vote for your favorite quarterback, Mark Sanchez or Tim Tebow. It's a little bit old, and I don't know how many of you know football very much, but if you look closely in the tip jar, there's nothing in those jars because they both sucked as quarterbacks. But there you have it. Actually, there's $1 in here, and usually what they do to enhance the signal of when you should tip at a self-serve frozen yogurt place is they throw a $1 bill into the thing that says, oh, see, people normally give $1, even though that was the worker who put it in at the beginning of the shift. That's kind of interesting. Now, I said that Uber drivers don't tip, or we don't tip Uber drivers. Is Uber popular out here? No. Okay. Usually when I give this talk in a big city where Uber is very popular, people go, no, Professor Gill, Uber does accept tips now. Right? And so I was hoping for that reaction from some folks. But what actually happened is that a couple years ago, back on April 24th, 2017, I was actually asked to write an article about Uber, whether or not they should allow tipping, and I said Uber would be wise to let their passengers tip. This was in Forbes magazine. Almost exactly 1 month later, Uber allows riders to tip drivers. You know, rarely do our ideas actually make it into the world of policy, but this was a success. I attribute it all to my Forbes article. Actually, it was in the works beforehand, but I felt pretty good that I'd affect this. Usually people who don't like tipping and who ride Uber a lot usually throw things at me at this point in the presentation, so I'm glad that Uber isn't popular here. So maybe tipping is popular here too. All right, that's the first argument, the principal agent problem. Here's the second one. Self-selecting or voluntary price discrimination. It also gives us a little opportunity to talk about gains from trade. Right here in this picture is something very dangerous in a restaurant situation. You might think that the waitress, her thumb is in the omelet. That might be the dangerous thing. Her thumb is indeed in the omelet, and that is probably not a great thing. But the bigger danger to restaurant owners here are these things right here, empty seats. If you're a restaurant owner, you have a lot of seats there, and if they're not getting filled every night, that's a lot of deadweight loss. You're paying for the rent of the building, and parts of that building are not being used for what they should be, to generate value, to generate business, to generate revenue. And on top of it, you might be keeping some of your staff on the floor just in case there's a big rush. Right? If there's a big busload of people come in all of a sudden and they're sitting down and you let all the waiters and waitresses go, one person has to do it, they're not going to provide very good service. So oftentimes you have a little bit of excess capacity in your staffing to deal with those situations. And if you continually have these empty seats and you keep those people on staff, you're going to end up losing money. And that's fairly dangerous here. So let's talk about price discrimination here. What I'm going to do is kind of give you a little lesson of gains from trade here. And here we have some customers, A, B, C, and D, and we have a restaurant owner here. If you remember any of this from Econ 101, I'm presenting it in a slightly different way, but every person who's a customer or a buyer has something known as a reserve buy price. And a reserve buy price is the highest price you would buy anything for. We all have these, right? Would I buy a cup of coffee for $1? Sure. Would I buy it for $10 million? No. Would I buy it for $3? Probably not. $2? Yes. Maybe $2 is the maximum that I would want to buy a cup of coffee for. No more than that, I would actually buy this. The cool thing about living in a world filled with diverse preferences and plurality is that we all have different reserve buy prices for different things. Some of you might not like coffee or might not like coffee as much as I do. I'd be willing to buy a cup of coffee for $2. Some of you down here, person D, might only want to buy it for $1. Some of you might only want to buy it for 25 cents. There might be other people that wouldn't buy it for anything. In fact, you could extend this negative and somebody would have to pay you to get a cup of coffee. But we won't worry about those kind of situations. So different people have different preferences. We have different buy prices for different kinds of goods. Some people love to go out to restaurants and have a good meal. Other people would rather cook at home. And it's not only different people, it's you at different times. Sometimes you really want a cup of coffee right before that, exam. You're feeling really sleepy. Man, I would pay $20 for a cup of coffee. But, on another time you want to go to bed or get to sleep before you get on a red-eye plane flight or something. You wouldn't pay even 10 cents for a cup of coffee. Sometimes you want to go out for a restaurant meal and really be a big splurger. You just got a promotion. You just graduated. It's really great. So you pay a lot. Maybe you pay $200 to go out for a meal. Other times, you might not spend that much because you're saving for a new car or you got to pay tuition and things like that. So we're going to kind of work on the top of the ramen at home for a while instead of going out. So it could be different people or you at different points in time in your life. Okay, that's my phone, which I did not sell. And it's a spammer. Great. All right. Now we have reserve buy prices, but we also have on the flip side of this somebody who's selling you stuff who has a reserve sell price. So the restaurant owner has a price that they won't go below when they exchange that restaurant experience for you. Right? A lot of this is determined by fixed costs like the rent of the building, the ingredients cost, the electricity, all those different things go into this. They say, well, I'd like to provide restaurant meals for people, but I can only provide them here maybe at $15. If the restaurant meal goes below that, I can't do it. I would actually lose money and that, so I wouldn't want to go below it. So this is what we call the reserve sell price. The lowest price somebody is willing to part with a good or service to the person who is buying it. In between here is what we call gains from trade. Okay? The difference between the reserve sell price and the highest reserve buy price here for this individual A is where gains from trade could become. Now, as you notice that the reserve sell price here overlaps with the reserve buy price. So, maybe the restaurant owner will sell the meal for $15. Maybe this person will buy it for $50. Wherever trade occurs in between there are gains from trade. That restaurant meal got allocated to somebody who values it more, right? I'm willing to part with it at $15. I value it at $50. It's sold to me for $15. Well, I get $35 of additional pleasure from that. That's great. It might be $25. So we can split up the gains from trade that the seller actually gets $10. They were willing to part with it for $15, but parted with it at $25, so they get $10 additional in gains from trade. And the other person who wanted it for $50 actually gets it for another $25 of pleasure. Great. We all benefit from those gains from trade here. Notice though, some people, if the reserve sell price is below the reserve buy price is below the reserve sell price, they won't engage in that trade. There are no gains from trade to be realized here. Here, if the restaurateur owner tries to keep the meal price as low as possible, and you have this reserve buy price up here, what if you created a norm that says if you enjoy the restaurant meal very well, not only pay the price that's listed on the bill that might reflect the reserve sell price, but maybe give 10% extra, 20% extra, 30% extra. And the way to do this is through labor costs. That's the one kind of variable cost. A lot of this here could be fixed costs. Labor costs could be a little bit more variable in terms of how many people you have, the skills of the people that you have in there as well. And so you can say, well, I'll keep my labor costs pretty low and shift the payment of the server to the individual based upon a rule of thumb, based upon a norm that says if it's good service, you should give 20% or maybe 25%. Bad service gives 0%, that principal agent on this. So this is what I call the tipping zone. right? The difference between the reserve sell price, or what the sale price is listed on the menu, and the reserve buy price is where anybody could potentially tip. Person A here could say, man, you know, I know the restaurant price at $15, but it was such a good meal. The ambiance was so good. The service, oh, mwah, the service was fantastic. I think I'll just throw in another $35. Thank you very much. It was worth that much to me because the service was that exquisite, right? So if you have a norm that says, go ahead, help out, pay what you consider to be your reserve buy price here, pay up to your reserve buy price, that actually can help the restaurant owner keep his reserve sell price a little bit lower here. What would happen if we got rid of tips? And we just normally said, well, instead of hoping people give 15%, maybe they'll give 25%, maybe they'll only give 10%. But if we just built in that 15% into the service charge here, that's going to raise their fixed cost. And the labor cost will become more fixed now, and the reserve sell price for this restaurateur will go up. Several things are starting to happen here, right? Now there's no more tipping. This is the no tipping or the no gratuities model. The first thing that happens is that there's wage gain to the staff. Yay! They like that. Right? They're not making that sub-minimum tip wage anymore. They're making that plus 15%, and that's consistently given to them. Yay, verily. And when selling these initiatives, you know, to raise the sub-minimum wage, that's usually the argument that's made, is that there's going to be wage gain to the staff right here. However, if you take away tipping and people no longer can decide to tip based upon their reserve prices, what could also happen is that the server could actually lose money. Right? Up here, especially with customer A, right? Customer A is like, wow, I was willing to pay up to $50 for this meal, but I don't have to tip anymore, I have to pay this. They might actually not give that money. And if you are a server who's very good at serving these customers and, you know, convincing them to give you big tips, and if you have a lot of clientele that are like this, you might actually lose money. Interestingly enough, a lot of the resistance to I-77 raising that sub-minimum tipped wage in Washington, D.C. came from some of the waiters and waitstaff that realized, no, yes, we're going to get a pay raise here, but we're going to lose out because, you know, what we were getting in tip was way up here because a lot of our customers are up here. And we're so good at convincing people to kind of give us more up to their reserve buy price. So they could potentially lose out in doing this. A lot of servers that I've talked to kind of acknowledge that. It's like, yeah, it'd be great to have higher wages, but at the expense of not getting tipped? No, I actually would end up losing money as well. The other thing that could happen is that if this goes up high enough, you could actually price out a customer here, not knowing what their reserve buy prices are. If you're a restaurant, you don't always know what these reserve buy prices are. They're always shifting. They're different between customers, but they're shifting on time-wise between you. You could price out some customers and lose business. That means empty seats. That means less revenue. That means you might go out of business. And that's pretty sad here. That could happen. Here's the other thing. And this is one of these, you know, kind of odd things, is that we're working for workers' right to give them that living wage, to increase it, get rid of the tips and all that kind of stuff, raise their wage. But the person that really benefits the most are really upscale customers who like to tip. This person, person A, might have paid this much for the meal before, but now, with no tipping, they only have to drop this on the table. They're the ones who actually benefit the most from all of this. And unfortunately, sometimes it benefits to they benefit at the expense of the waiter or waitress who could have captured some of those gains from trading. And the other thing too is, as you increase the reserve sell price here, not knowing where any of the reserve buy price is, it's very possible that somebody who kind of hits right there at the sweet spot, if there's any kind of perturbation in the market, it looks like a recession is coming, or we had our refrigerator break or something like that, this person could easily be priced out. So you did price out some people, but the more and more you raise that reserve sell price, especially if you don't really know what these reserve buy prices are, you could potentially lose more business in the future. By the way, this is why restaurants like to keep menu prices low. They're not sure who these customers are. They kind of have a general sense of it, But as economic conditions change, it's really kind of hard to know what that is, and they could lose a lot of people. You get those empty tables, and eventually you have to close down. And that's not a really good thing. It would be better if we could keep the lower reserve prices here, and then let people kind of compensate up to where they're comfortable with. Yeah, this person might not be a big tipper. This person might not be a big tipper either, but at least they're coming in and they're putting a butt in the seat. And for the restaurant owner, that's really important. And if the restaurant owner is seating customers, they're going to be able to keep staff on. If they start losing people, you're going to have to start laying off staff or reducing shifts, reducing hours in the shifts. And that could also come at the expense of the total net take-home pay for your servers. Okay, when it comes to the model of no gratuity service, I always have a picture of Keith Moon in all my presentations. I think he was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. He was the drummer for The Who, if you didn't know. But the no gratuities model has some kind of outcomes that have here. First of all, it eliminates the self-selecting price discrimination. Now the big tippers don't have to worry about big tips anymore. They can just pay what's listed on the menu, right? And that service charge, the 15% that Ivar's Salmon House put on there. As we noted before, this could potentially shrink your customer base. And that's not good. Empty seats, deadly for restaurants. It also complicates the principal agent problem because now, you know, if I'm going to get paid $15 an hour, no matter if I give bad service or good service, you know, I might not try as hard. Now, this is not to cast aspersions on waiters and waitresses. It's not like they're going to give really bad service. But at the margin, you know, you come into work with a hangover one day, you really don't want to smile? If you're going to get $15 no matter what, you're probably not going to smile. Those screaming kids over in the corner table, oh, I really don't want to keep visiting that table. Before, when I got tips, yeah, you know, those parents look pretty, you know, sad about their kids. Maybe they're going to drop me a big tip, so then I'm going to go and visit them a little bit more. But now, if I'm getting $15 consistently, I'm just not going to do that. Right? I don't have to pay as much attention to the water glasses filling that up. I don't have to pay as much attention to the customer that keeps looking at their watch. Right, and wants to get to the theater on time, or to those customers that want to be left alone to linger over those meals. I want to just, you know, get rid of them. You know, I want to get out of here tonight. That kind of thing. And so it kind of reduces the quality of service, the marginal quality of service. You're going to get a little bit more grumpier wait staff and things like that. The other thing this creates, and a restaurant owner brought this to my attention, I even thought about this, it creates a shift problem. Restaurants tend to be pretty busy Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night. Monday, Tuesdays are usually pretty slow. Right? If you get paid $15 an hour, whether you're working a busy night or a slow night, now busy nights are hard. You got to hustle, and people are going to maybe yell at you because you got the wrong order or something like that. You'd rather work Mondays. It's slow. You can kind of take your time. You don't have to put as much effort in there. You know, $15 an hour. I get paid the same Monday or Friday. I want to work on Mondays. And if your restaurant determines shifts by seniority, the people who've been around the most are the ones who are going to choose what shifts they want. Those people are probably going to start choosing Monday and Tuesdays. And your least experienced staff is actually going to be working Fridays when you need them the least, right? You need the most experienced people there on a Friday or Saturday. And so that could create lots of problems there in terms of staffing and shifting, staffing the shifts there. And then finally, it also reduces the signals to poor quality servers. If everybody's getting $15 an hour at the end of the night, right, you're all getting, maybe somebody gets a raise or something like that, the employer might know that, but hey, I'm getting what everybody else is. I don't really learn if I'm doing a good job or not, or if I should improve, or if I should leave. And so you might get people who shouldn't be in this industry lingering in that industry a little bit longer. Interestingly enough, the no gratuities model is only being used at very small, high-end kind of boutique restaurants. Ones where the manager kind of knows and can see the people a little bit better. One where you have a small clientele where you know what their reserve prices are. It's the same clientele that comes in all the time. And you can pretty much figure out they're pretty consistent 15% tipper, so let's just skip it and raise everything to 15% and just kind of skip that kind of thing. That's where it tends to be successful. It's not being very successful at some of these larger restaurants. And indeed, I got some empirical verification of this over the years. Ivar's Salmon House that I mentioned, Once they went to their no gratuities model, they saw a 7% decline in their seatings, the number of people that came into the restaurant. That indicates they raised the prices to the point where 7%, 7 out of every 100 people, said, no, we're priced out, we can't come in. That's empty seats. And it also, interestingly, led to a 10% drop in revenue. I talked to the manager and they said, yeah, not only were people not coming in, but when they came in, they saw the higher prices, they weren't ordering the extra glass of wine or the dessert. And they were going for some of the lower price entrees or skipping appetizers and things like this. After 2 years, Ivar's decided this was a disaster and they went back to it. It took them another 2 years to actually get back to their same seatings, same number of seatings, and bring that revenue back up. So there was kind of a big disaster. Not only was it Ivar's that found this out, but Danny Meyer's restaurant found it out as well. Right, as I mentioned, the people who are going to lose out on this are the ones who are really good wait staff that can actually induce people to give big tips and to have more take-home pay. Danny Myers admitted that a large portion of his best staff members actually left over the no tipping changes. He actually reversed course on this too, and I think there's only 1 or 2 of his smaller boutique restaurants that are still no tipping models in New York. So again, more empirical verification for this, and I'm still working on a project that's actually trying to test all of this right now. So I'm pretty happy to see that my ideas that I published a couple years ago are bearing some fruit. The last thing, cultural institutions of trust. Here's the big question. Why would you ever go to a restaurant that you know you're never going to come back to? You're committed to paying $25 for the meal if that's what it says on the bill. Why would you ever leave more money on the table, right? This gets to this issue between thin and thick utility within the kind of core foundations of economic analysis. A thinly rational person always likes more compared to less, right? Or wants to save as much money relative to anything. And if part of your reason for tipping is that you want to ensure better service in the future. I tipped really well at my favorite tavern, the Duval Tavern. It actually ended up saving my life one time. How is that, Professor Gill? Well, Duval Tavern doesn't take reservations for seats, but at every Seahawks game, I have my seat at the bar reserved for me because I'm a pretty good tipper, right? And one day during one of the Seahawks games, I was out at a conference and I forgot to tell them, and they had the little, they usually put, instead of a reserve sign, they have a glass of water there with a little coaster on top to tell people not to sit there. That's Tony's seat. And I wasn't there. All of a sudden I get this phone call, and it's from the Duval Tavern. I go, hi, and he goes, Tony, are you all right? I go, yeah. He says, you're not here tonight. We thought you might have drove off a cliff. We're about to send a search and rescue party. I was like, ooh. Had I gone over a cliff, they would have came out and rescued me. So tip well. But if you're never going to go back to a restaurant, right, putting down that 10%, 15, 20% tip is just basically burning resources. You're never going to see these people again. You don't need to induce them to have better service next time. So why would you ever do it? Here's the argument. Adam Smith had a very basic formula for the wealth of nations, for why societies prosper. And it was basically the division of labor plus expanded markets yields prosperity. But the problem with expanded markets is as we interact with more and more people, we know them less and less. We engage in quasi-anonymous or anonymous trade, people that we don't know very well. And that's problematic because one of the biggest impediments to trade is uncertainty. If I don't know your intentions, I'm not sure I want to engage in a trade with you. So I need to know, I need some kind of signal, I need something in society that tells me, yes, we're a trusting population. We all trust one another. And societies over time have built up these little ritualistic traditions to basically ameliorate problems of trust, or to actually bolster trust within societies here, right? And so we have all these nominal rituals. Tipping is just one of these. Another one, I'm working on a project with another friend of mine from Creighton on gift giving. Like, gift giving is completely economically nonsensical. Why would you just give something to somebody? And our argument is that societies have done this throughout history as a way of showing I'm willing to sacrifice resources because in the future I might need something from you, you might need something from me. You can trust me to pay a high cost for that. I'm not just going to get up and go and run. I'll give you a good example of this, right? whenever you're dating, this happened to me one time. First date, I took a wonderful gal out to a restaurant, and we had a nice meal. And at the end of the date, I actually pulled out a coupon to pay for the meal. Never went out with her again. The reason is because she's looking at this to say, okay, are you future spouse material? Are you willing to sacrifice when times are tough? No, you're going to pull out the coupon. You're a cheapskate, Professor Gill, as a graduate student, Gill at the time. I don't want you around, right? But if you're a big tipper and you throw down a big tip, it says, oh, that person's willing to sacrifice for me. This person might be a keeper. Think of it another way. You're going to go out, you're going to create a business with somebody, right? Maybe a small enterprise making an app or something. And you go, let's hash this out over a dinner tonight. And you go out during the dinner, and the bill comes, and the person says, oh, I'll take care of that. But they don't leave a tip. You're like, huh, you're not willing to sacrifice resources. What if our company gets into trouble a couple of months later or a year later? Are you going to be there to sacrifice the resources that you need in order to make this company successful? That little subtle signal says no. Not giving a tip says no. But if you give a big tip, you say, yeah, that person's generous. They're generous with their money now. They might be generous with their resources at a time we really need it. They're willing to make that kind of sacrifice. And again, tipping is one of these things. Places that don't actually have tipping, people say, well, there's no tipping in Japan, right? But they have this tradition of just little gift giving all the time. It serves the same kind of purpose, which is really kind of interesting. And this is something that actually Thomas Hobbes recognized. If you're familiar with his book, The Leviathan, it has kind of a very negative view of human nature, that life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, and people are going to rip each other off and beat each other up and all that kind of stuff. That's usually what you read in your intro philosophy class. But deeper in the book, Hobbes says, you know, even though life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, we as a species didn't end up killing ourselves into extinction. We somehow figured out how to get along. And one of these things was being generous by gifting, right? And what he says here, and I'm just going to read this here, that a man which receiveth benefit from another of mere grace, of just kind of giving with no reason other than just to give. Endeavor that he which giveth it have no reasonable cause to repent him of his goodwill. For no man giveth, but with the intention of good to himself. Right there he's stating, humans are self-interested bastards. Right? But they understand this. Gift, because gift is voluntary, and of all voluntary acts, the object is to every man his own good, of which, and this is important, if men see that they should ever be frustrated, there will be no beginning of benevolence or trust, nor consequence of mutual help. Okay? Not of one man reconciliation with one man to another, and therefore they are to remain still in the condition of war. Fancy language, what it's saying is that we use gifting to prevent us from killing one another. To say, listen, I'm not hostile to you. I know the world is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, but here's a gift. Here's a tip. Trust me. And if we all do that, society will be more trusting, it'll be more peaceful, it'll be more prosperous. Thomas Hobbes would have been a good tipper. Just kind of finish up with this. The last questions that I have here is, where do these norms originate and change? As I mentioned, they don't have tipping in Japan. Tipping largely is a European tradition that kind of comes, oh my gosh, I gotta learn how to turn off my phone. All right. Okay. Tipping is largely a European tradition that we think began in Britain somewhere in the, I think it was like the 1400s, 1500s. Right? It's kind of murky when it actually began. And it kind of spread out to the Americas and things like this, and a few other places like Brazil and Argentina, Australia have kind of picked up, kind of where you can see the fingers of the British Empire. Tipping tends to predominate. Actually, it was fairly common in the European continent as well. In France, they don't accept tips today, but as late as the early 1950s, they did. Why that actually disappeared, I have no idea. It would be the great topic for a thesis. I'm kind of curious on that. Or even how they operate. Right? This is the problem with studying norms, is that we just kind of do this now. We don't understand where the rules of thumb come from. We don't know how they operate or get transmitted. It's really kind of murky. But in some cases we do. As I said before, I didn't know you're supposed to tip housekeeping until they told me, hey, Professor Gill, here's an envelope. you know, your attendant was so-and-so. You should remember to tip that person. Be very kind. It's like, oh, okay, that's how I'm doing that. It's kind of interesting, and I'm more and more interested in the economics of culture. How we generate these rules of thumb, these norms, these little rituals in life to help govern our societies. And people like Adam Smith was very interested in this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And another book that I recommend, a very short one by an anthropologist some 70 years ago, Marcel Mauss, called The Gift. You know, that gifting, just like Thomas Hobbes had kind of intuitively observed, is common throughout history. And through almost every culture, there's some kind of gifting type of thing where we give to one another to build trust, to say, I'm not your enemy, trust me. Let's engage in peaceful transactions and become more prosperous. And also another one of my favorite public choice theorists, James Buchanan, wrote about the rules of etiquette, right? That most of our life is actually governed by informal rules, not formal laws. And those informal rules are actually quite important here. And with that said, I open this up to questions, comments, and any gratuities that you might have. If you're angry at me and get really angry, I just want to point out that's our cute little puppy dog. So, you know, negative comments would be like kicking a puppy dog. We don't want to do that. And if you ever have any tip jars that look interesting, please send them to me, or if you want more information, my email is up there. So thank you very much. Time for a few questions? Yes, April.
Hi. There's a belief in the restaurant world that as technology continues to take over more and more things, that the point of sale will actually be on the table, and it'll be less about service from an individual and more just maybe like a food runner in the kitchen that is responsible for bringing all the things out that people order themselves. If that were the case, if that were the future, how would you think that would affect what you presented today?
Yeah, first of all, I stopped going to restaurants because I don't want to be served by the Terminator, right? I'm worried about that kind of robot world. I know I shouldn't be, but I still am. I guess I'm a human being in that regard. I'm going to reverse that question a little bit because, interestingly enough, this is actually a response that is happening in Seattle. Seattle just recently raised minimum wages, not only minimum wages, but the sub-minimum tipping wages. And the businesses that operate with a lot of labor at that kind of minimum wage level, namely service industries like the hotel industry, like the restaurant industry, have reacted to this by moving to more of that point of service thing. So there was a study from the University of Washington, some people in our Evans School of Public Policy, that said, how are restaurants responding to this increase in minimum wage? And they moved away from the full service where the waiter and waitress comes to your table to now what we call point of service, right? So you order at the counter, they give you a little number, you sit down at a table, maybe they call you up to get it, or maybe somebody brings it to you, but it's not the waiter-waitress experience that you have with the linen tablecloth type of service. And so more restaurants are starting to do that. I think that's kind of sad, right? Now when you kind of, I like the interaction. I'm a talkative person, as you probably can tell, and I like interacting with my servers, and I just enjoy that experience. For me, it's a human experience. And if we take more of that out, at least for me, it's going to be sad. On the other hand, you know, we might be able still to keep meals cheap. In an increasing high-wage environment like in Seattle, this is one way you still are able to keep restaurant meals priced at a price that poorer people can actually afford. And by the way, that's one of the things that people forget about that price discrimination thing. It's like, yay, we raised the income of the server, especially some of the servers who can't get a lot of tips. But on the other hand, price people out, the poor people who can't afford that nice, you know, once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks night out on the town. And that, to me, that's sad. We got to calculate that in all of our economic calculations. So, yeah, moving toward point of service, I don't know. It's keep restaurant prices down, but you know, it's not the same thing. Kind of sad. Yes, in the back.
Yeah. As Western Europe has moved away from tipping, are there indications that social society trust has deteriorated?
I don't know the trust. I mean, that's a great, obviously, you know, predictive hypothesis from this. I don't know what the data on trust is saying. I've heard anecdotally that trust has kind of gone down, and tension and hostilities kind of have increased. There's a lot of other reasons for that going on. I do know that when people do visit European restaurants and that, they say, you know, the service isn't bad, it's not as good, right? There's some kind of things like, actually, my friend from Baylor, Chuck North, actually took a group of people to Britain, and he's constantly emailing me saying, oh, we went to this pub and they didn't accept tips, and I got one beer and that was it. They didn't want to serve me, right? Oh, and they were all kind of frustrated with that kind of thing. But yeah, that would be any of you looking for a senior thesis or a topic to study. Yeah, has social trust deteriorated as the propensity to tip or gift has gone down, and have there been other substitute rituals that have kind of backfilled that? There's a question here. Yes.
I was thinking the first time I went on a cruise, and I don't know if you looked at that kind of tipping, because at least when I've been on it, they don't allow you to tip. You have to give them a big pile of money at the end as a tip, but what their philosophy was that you will see a lot of the servers, but there are a lot of people doing a lot of work behind the scenes that make your cruise experience really wonderful, and you don't see them, so it's not fair to them if you just tip the people you see. So therefore we just take a big pile of money and then we divvy up amongst it. So we're actually trusting them to divvy the money up to all those behind the scenes people, or maybe they don't, I don't know.
Let me generalize that, because that's an issue that comes up too. There are some restaurant establishments that actually have all their servers pool the tips.
Right.
And not only pool the tips, sometimes share them with what they call back of house,
Right.
the dishwashers, the cooks, and all that kind of
Right.
thing. Interestingly enough, again, another thesis topic, I don't know the answer to this, about half the states in the United States prohibit that kind of tip sharing with the back of the house, which is weird. Like, if I get a bunch of cash, and by the way, I think Washington is one of these states. I won't say what place it happens to be, but I know it very well, and they've almost saved my life one time. The servers actually take some of their tips and they tip the cooks in the back, because there's a principal agent problem there too. Is that you know, if they screwed up in an order on a very busy night, they need to go back to the cook and say, hey, could you give me a rush order, because I don't want the Gills to be unhappy with their meal and things like that. And you have to be on good terms with them. And if you tip them, they're going to treat you well. You're right. Oh yeah, Esther, your tip. I shouldn't say any names. We really start from this thing. This is real weird. You know, Esther would say, hey, thank you very much. I'm going to, throw you guys $20 at the end of the night, and Esther gets her service.
Because the IRS? Because of how
I
you
don't
declare
know.
tips, and that's why they make it illegal?
It has to be done at the state level, because half the states do it,
Yeah.
half the states don't. Some restaurants do, some restaurants don't. I'd be interested in studying that as well. There's so many topics that haven't been studied this. But yeah, so there's that thing with the cruise, is that, we'll just go ahead and pool it all, because there are people behind the scenes. Now, the solution to this is to allow people to get tips are the ones that have that principal agent, customer service kind of skills, and the people in the background, the dishwashers and stuff, they won't be tipped, but you give them higher salaries or higher pay or whatever it might be. And that's usually kind of how it works.